Welcome to Osei Nation with Marilyn Stark. This is Marilyn. Episode 6, Part 1. So, who exactly is Putin anyway? On January 20th, 2025, we had the honor of witnessing, on live broadcasts everywhere throughout the land, the 60th inauguration of the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump, the 45th and now 47th President of our great democracy. Held in the stately rotunda, the inauguration reflected the ceremonious presence of our nation's great leaders as they accompanied the moment and the man with their respective and collective presence. Normally, the swearing-in ceremony for an American president is held outdoors. Indeed, the last swearing-in of a president held in the rotunda and not held outdoors happened to be that of President Ronald Reagan in 1985. One might immediately draw a comparison of the two presidents, one to the other, for their own respective roles of presidential leadership as trailblazers. President Ronald Reagan fended in the resolution of the arms race with the USSR during the Cold War, so many decades ago, while President Donald Trump seems to be somehow stationed now, even yet today, at similar crossroads of global circumstances with Russia. Today, that is, the nations of the world are hearing the echoes of nuclear threats from that very Cold War era of the 80s as they grip the present world stage, the world today. For today, a Russian war theater which has been created by the illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russia's President Vladimir Putin has challenged and changed drastically the world order. Indeed, the redounding nuclear endangerments of that past Cold War era now concern the world peace all over again. We must now watch human rights crash into nothingness. Occurrences of environmental derangements, loss of infrastructure, the authority of prevaricative reports that populate the news broadcasts from the Russian side as they seemingly daunt the wider people, economic growth of the two embroiled nations stunted, and other such scarring effects as the Russo-Ukrainian War rages on and on, creating lost lives and rubble of a day. Indeed, this seems to be the nuclear day all over again, as if it had never surceased, and it is so fundamentally horrific. Thus, as President Trump takes charge of our nation for the second time, and as he takes charge also of the presidential record of deeds, with drastically differing policies performed by a previous administration, with his new charge, we citizens are expanding our hopes for peace settlement in harmony with the visionary, the returning President Donald Trump. In fact, Trump has been given a profound mandate by the people of this nation. As he continues his presidential rule now, after a 4-year hiatus, it is most likely that many of the more liberal persuasion politically will begin to see past the weighty propaganda the insiders of Washington had slated in their now defeated efforts to politically end him altogether. Given the gigantic tasks he had to perform in surmounting all of the obstacles the Democrats had placed before him over 8 long years before today, such biased rebuke for made-up reasons that were even proven to be false. One can surmise that there are indeed very few men who could withstand the steep tests of endurance that had inveighed upon him. But he did it. He valued and believed in America's return to its normalcy of greatness, even in the face of odds that were daunting also to us onlookers. In summary, this was the tempestuous storm of lawfare our great leader was required to weather in order to regain his office of the presidency. Thus, his victory is not only his, rather, it is a victory as well for the rule of law in our great democracy. President Trump most definitely knows this. His complacency of mind on inaugural day tells us that he is more than ready for the term in office ahead of him. Today, President Trump faces a more deeply warring world than he had known when he took office in 2016. There came, on October 7th, 2023, a grave strike against the world peace when the tragedy of a further flare-up of war in the typically entangled Middle East occurred. Hamas attacked Israel. This resulted in the killing of 1,200 people, and about 250 hostages were also taken. This flare-up reminds us, alas, of the way of man to wage war, to simply destroy lives. Whither the enemy? It is said that an American president is likely to be measured by his or her prowess in foreign policy. If this is so for Trump, even with and beyond his historic political movement known as MAGA, Make America Great Again, then we pray that his vision of peace for Ukraine and Russia and for the Israelis and Palestinians will arise to give results that are much needed. For if we are to succeed at home with the several vital tasks President Trump has delineated for us people, then we are in such a shored-up stance and status that is much more equipped to deal with duties abroad that pertain to the question of freedom's destiny, to the question of humanity's care, as such questions play upon the values of the free world, the West. Hamas is both a political entity and an armed militia, and Hamas has ruled in the Gaza Strip for 18 years now. Israel has, of course, been retaliating against the recent brutal attack in southern Israel by Hamas by attacking in Gaza. In what has been called the Israel-Hamas war, Israel has also been leveling Hezbollah of Lebanon, who had militarily fused on the side of the Palestinians. This attack on Hezbollah, in turn, affected the Syrian civil war at the time. Since Hezbollah could no longer maintain its participation in the defense of the Assad regime in Syria, since it was neutralized by Israel in the war, Syria was actually deeply affected by the loss of Hezbollah. Indeed, Syria lost on its battlefield both Russia, who was committed to its war in Ukraine, and Hezbollah. The government of Syria underwent a powerful insurgency by several militant factions, including HTS, who spearheaded the operation, as the city of Aleppo was almost completely taken over by the 30th of November in 2024. The defense of Aleppo was in a state of military weakness. There was rampant corruption of the pro-government military forces there, besides there being lack of command and low morale, and thus Aleppo succumbed quickly to opposition forces. Over the next few days, Bashar al-Assad was to be finally felled altogether as president of Syria in a lightning-fast swoop by HTS from Hama in the northwest of Syria down to its capital city of Damascus. The tides of war in the Middle East, where there are multivariate conflicts, have indeed changed since that fall of the 50-some-odd-year rule of the Assad family in Syria. What a brutal dictatorial family the Assad family had been. Yes, it was in December of 2024 that a great end to the 14-year Syrian civil war in the Middle East indeed did occur, as just stated. It was the militant group HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, that moved from Hama to Homs to Damascus. Under the leadership of Abu Mohammed al-Golani, HTS took the fore of lightning military sweep as he proceeded to Damascus, leaving no place for the now defenseless Assad to go except as to flee. Since all of his troops had retreated from their defense positions on the field, Assad eventually escaped his own homeland for Russia on December 8th for the refuge Putin had offered him. First came the end to Syria's long and brutal civil war on December 8th, 2024. Miraculously, then came a 60-day ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas war, beginning on January 19th, 2025. Indeed, political leaders and analysts worldwide must have been grappling with the coupling of wars with a world order that had undergone drastic change due to Putin's nuclear threats, and they still are doing so. For these are the two wars that have been rampantly breaking the world peace, now coming into the hold of a state devoid of war once again. Syria, who ended their civil war, and the Israel-Hamas war, whose sides have struck a ceasefire. So no, the very world order, having undergone drastic changes due to Putin's threats of the use of his nuclear arsenal, is actually moving ostensibly in the direction of peace. Putin had surmised that he could ultimately subdue the West itself, and especially the United States as his arch-nemesis, by brutally practicing a genocidal level of war on Ukraine. How is it, then, that this precipitation of peace in the planet's hotbed of war itself, the Middle East, would have resulted from having been triangulated so masterfully into the Middle East from the Russo-Ukrainian War? Let us regard that this was due in large part to attrition of the military might of Russia, as she would contend ferociously in Ukraine. Putin could not even sustain his believable prowess in the Russo-Ukrainian battlefield of war without having left Syria's battlefield effectively, nor without calling on troops from North Korea to give him the crutches he needs to persist in Kursk. It is in Kursk where Ukraine is challenging Putin's former unidimensional taker of land status. In truth, Putin, on the 20th of January, was effectively thrown out of his power hold at the Tartus naval base by Syria's de facto government. Even though the shift of military bases around the world as to their respective occupiers is quite labile over time, Russia's loss of Tartus means the end of the only naval base outside of Russia's borders, or so they say. Russia's naval presence in the Arctic is replete with icebreakers, submarines, and all kinds of defensive and offensive materiel. Since land is so sparse and permafrost can cave in, how, then, can observers of Russia's naval presence in the Arctic perceive any naval base there? Perhaps it becomes more of the presence of an entire fleet that characterizes Russia's presence in the Arctic. So as the ice melts in the Arctic Ocean, is Russia not gaining a new and more robust naval presence in the global theater over greater time? Of course she is. Importantly, though, with the loss of the Tartus naval base in Syria, Russia has now thereby lost its projection of power in the Mediterranean Sea, whilst she is sharpening the low opinion of other nations through her misbehavior in the Black Sea. There in the Black Sea, where her shadow fleet of ships carrying oil for an illicit trade that fights the war sanctions placed upon her by the West, those shadow fleet ships keep falling apart due to age and being overloaded. Thus, Russia is ruining the ecology of the sea with repeated oil spills. How many more resultant oil spills can the ecology of the Black Sea tolerate? Nor does Russia own up and clean up the oil spills, leaving that detail to locals. In fact, the largest nation in the world, Russia, lives in this day, in the here and now, as some kind of supposed giant in size, more or less shoved up into the icy cold Arctic as a great isolate, barely surviving now due to the war, lacking a great projection into the world at large. The visionary Putin is losing his LNG dreams up north in the Arctic due to Western sanctions and lack of gas tankers, and the changes in the geopolitical world order based upon the melting of the Arctic Ocean's ice nowadays make other nations very much aware of Russia's presence in the Arctic, of her plans for opening trade channels as new shipping opportunities grip the horizon of the future. Well, it is no wonder that President Trump is calling on the West to support his bid to gain Greenland. This gain of Greenland would be for reasons obvious to the light of need, to stand up to a future Russia. Russia may very well withstand the test of time, no matter its win or loss in Syria and then in Ukraine. The icy isolate of the Russian Empire, in a revanchist way of thinking, may find a neat detour around her ancient leanings to gain warm water ports as a more contemporary geophysical Cold War of the Arctic diminishes that older question of the westward reach of the empire. However, Tartus had been Putin's great interest. Russia shamefacedly tried to belittle somehow the new and developing government of Syria as being open yet to continuing the lease of Tartus for Russia in order to realize a greater longevity of her fleet in the Mediterranean Sea. The naval base at Tartus had been a stronghold for Russia, an importantly vital station for refueling and a go-around to the necessity of returning to the Black Sea for upkeep of ships as well. Russia is also involved with African nations, and just across the waters from Tartus is Africa conveniently situated. Although as observers we cannot know exactly how the new Syrian government will fare under the de facto leadership of Ahmed al-Sharaa, the leader of the HTS militia that conquered Damascus, ousting Assad, Sharaa declares from his current seat that HTS should ultimately go into dissolution. At least the brutal war in Syria has come to an end. Estimates as to the number of casualties in the Syrian civil war are ongoing. One of those estimates is now at 620,000 dead, alongside greater than 14 million Syrian citizens, necessarily displaced to other nations. Recently, on January 19th, 2025, according to France 24, Ahmed al-Sharaa, in a meeting with Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan, announced that all weapons present in Syria should come under state possession. Moreover, Sharaa announced the upcoming formation of an army such that all factions owning weapons will go into dissolution as they surrender their arms and join the army. These are important words for Sharaa to have spoken to Turkey, since they portend not only a peace-giving deed coming from former fighters in the Syrian civil war, but also their belonging to the new Syrian state. This is a sign of a movement towards unification. One cannot help but observe that the new Syria needs an army as well. The new leader of Syria called out factions that are located in the SDF area in the oil-rich, more northeastern area of Syria and along the Euphrates River, and he also called out for the SDF itself to cede their arms. SDF is the acronym for Syrian Democratic Forces, which are Syrian-led and U.S.-backed. The SDF sets up the idea of creating a secular, democratic Syria. We can all rejoice at the freeing of hostages by Hamas that recently occurred. On January 25th, 2025, Palestinian prisoners were freed by Israeli jailers. These events stand as harbingers of peace to come, as a temporary ceasefire deal between the Hamas group and Israel as of January 19th has been successfully negotiated. The world watches as the triphasic ceasefire now begins to further unfold. Do you typically listen to media news and commentaries on wars? If you do, then you must have heard of the change in world order that came with Putin's outrageous threats to use nuclear power in Ukraine. This threatening posture of Putin has been enacted in order to subjugate the nation of Ukraine while bossing the West and Ukraine regarding arms supplies. In this vein of news, then, undoubtedly, one has heard of the fears that now inhabit the minds of the world's leaders who espy possible escalation of the war beyond Ukraine's borders, and that even unto a possible world war itself, World War III. Unthinkable not too long ago, this nuclear weapons factorial now figures into the equation of situational politics gone awry as we witness the horrors of a democracy-loving people, the Ukrainians, undergo an attempted genocide itself. Indeed, NATO is on high alert and amassing troops in readiness in Europe. Newsweek recently, on December 3, 2024, quoted Andrius Kubilius, the European Union's Commissioner for Defense, as having said that both EU and NATO officials, quote, agree that Vladimir Putin could be ready for confrontation with NATO and the EU in 6 to 8 years. End of quote. The British newspaper Metro just published the news that, according to the article's title, British troops sent to NATO's frontline preparation for invasion by Russia. The article goes on to report that the UK has deployed thousands of British troops to Romania and Bulgaria, troops that will stand at the ready for a possible Russian incursion on NATO in the near future. This deployment, a veritable test of military capabilities in its own right, is named Steadfast Dart, where the question of the capabilities of quick mobilization of troops and army vehicles will be fathomed according to the testing of military science parameters as to the ability to move large convoys over great distance in case of urgent defense needs. Indeed, Sweden and Finland have recently joined NATO since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Sweden on March 7th, 2024, and Finland on April 4th, 2024. This enlargement of NATO, of course, went counter to Russia's own parochial preferences regarding NATO's influence as per its size. These two historically more neutral Nordic countries in their respective dispositions towards war alliance underwent a fundamental rethinking of how to be best grounded at present. Indeed, that grounding would be best through a staunch collective deterrence via Article 5 of NATO's Charter. This newly formulated readiness to join NATO on the part of Sweden and Finland was in direct response to Russia's revanchist leanings. Once such revanchist leanings were exemplified by Putin's invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022. Many thinkers say that Putin lives in a revanchist dream rather than that he is merely fighting a war in order to keep his own personal power intact. It could be both. Article 5 of the NATO Charter renders a mutual defensive strategy whereby all NATO members stand ready to rally militarily in the event a member nation is struck militantly by a hostile nation. Thus, a strike against one is a strike against all. Putin, of course, thinks he is already in a warring posture with the West, with U.S. specifically, since the U.S. leads the West. In fact, the Syrian civil war had placed Russia at proxy loggerheads with the U.S. According to Newsweek, there are reportedly 500,000 troops, 500,000 troops, in some form of readiness for a possible all-out war with Russia. Some 40,000 troops are actually stationed physically in NATO member countries in the region near Ukraine. This is patently demonstrative of an elaborate defensive shoring up of vital security by concrete plans, as nations of Europe leave behind the once scaled-down militaries since what has been termed the end of the Cold War. The theoretical end of the Cold War came when Reagan and Gorbachev successfully resolved rivalrous, hostile minds, one towards the other, bringing about an historic peace that had related to a veritable arms race. Finally, these two leaders became the architects of peace with the ratification of the INF Treaty, Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, in June 1988. In actuality, the industrial sector, besides the military sector, has been moved into the practical agendas of NATO nations in recent years due to Russia's aggressions towards Eastern European nations through its seemingly vicarious militancy in Ukraine. This change in the active agendas of NATO nations dates back to 2014 in response to Russia's annexation of Crimea. Moreover, the defensive response of NATO nations unto themselves since 2014 can be traced to the ongoing clashes in the Donbass of Ukraine as well. It should be stated that a point of weakness on the part of democracy-loving nations of the West has been called by Kyiv regarding Ukraine's experience with Russia over its annexation of Crimea and warring in Donbass from 2014 onward. It seems the West was not adequately concerned, nor sufficiently engaged with Ukraine's plight, yet Ukraine is definitely in alliance ideologically with the West. the hopes and prayers of many people in our nation of America lie in the destiny of Ukraine to remain integral territorially unto its 1991 borders, as the Russo-Ukrainian War may come to an end eventually. The thinking goes along the beaten path that Ukraine should remain a true and sovereign democratic nation with its democracy-loving people, as it so chooses to be, since this is the proven, beaten path of the West, the free world. The deeper aspects of this question and the many questions that relate to the outcome of the Russo-Ukrainian War are the topic of future episodes. Thank you.